Hey there, guys. This is our last day of notes. Kind of want to wrap up this idea of the Renaissance, which was a rebirth or a new way of thinking um, back in Europe. And, the Renaissance was not just art, it was science and architecture and writing and all things that had to do with new ways of thinking. Remember, we learned that nationalism, secularism, and humanism all came from these ideas of, questioning authority, not being so religious, believing that humans, like in humanism, that people are smart enough to like think for themselves and to learn more about the world. And so, in the world of science, one big deal was that the church had always taught that everything revolved around the earth, right? Of course, we know that to be not true, but this is what was believed and this is what was taught by the church. Well, Nicholas Copernicus had the guts to go against the church, and he was able to prove that the earth actually revolves around the sun, that all the planets do. And this was a big deal because this did go against the authority of the church. But that's all connected to this idea of new thinking that happened during the Renaissance. And so they began to study animals and human anatomy and medicine and stars and planet, and they were now getting this, ancient learnings and teachings and writings from the Greeks and Romans, and also what was being learned in the Islamic worlds, especially in medicine and human anatomy. And so they were just getting super smart and learning these things. And this would also be other scientists at that time would have been, like Galileo and Isaac Newton and that. So Leonardo da Vinci was not just an artist. He was a scientist, an engineer, an inventor. And we know that his ideas and that from the sketches that were found in his many notebooks. And he was really ahead of his time, inventing ideas for a glider, like an airplane, a helicopter even, and a parachute, among many other inventions. So hundreds and hundreds of years before his time, he had ideas for these things that we just take for granted today. In the world of art, we've talked about this, but they began to change. They went from this very flat, dull-colored, two-dimension, pictures with no emotion, to in the Renaissance, where people begin to look like they do in real life. In fact, the paintings almost look like it's photography because they're so realistic. They use something called perspective. They learned how to draw things smaller in the back and bigger in the front to make it look three-dimensional. And then also the use of light and shadows to show emotion, and to show that realism in the pictures. It was just the art really came alive at that time. And three of those most famous artists, Italian artists from the time, were Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and Michelangelo. And of course, they do sound like Ninja Turtles, of course, but these were three very famous and probably three of the most famous artists in the world still today. Here's an example of medieval or Middle Age art. This was before the Renaissance. You'll notice that the colors are kind of drab and kind of dull, but most important, it's two-dimensional. It's flat. It looks like a comic strip, or almost like a cartoon. So there's no dimension or no perspective in it. There's no shadowing going on. You'll notice even like the folds in the dress here or in the robe it's not very realistic. It's very simple, and it's just there's no dimension. They all look like they're all two-dimensional on the same plane. But then take a look at Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa during the Renaissance, and things change. It looks almost like a photograph. Look at the folds over here in her dress. I mean, it looks so real. Look at the shadowing in her fingers, even in her knuckles. Look at the shadow underneath her chin, very three-dimensional. Look at the emotion on her face, and if you look back and forth or move your head, you'll notice that it looks like her eyes are following you. It's all part of this three-dimensional thing called perspective. Pretty amazing. Da Vinci's other, really actually most famous work is called The Last Supper, which is a picture of Jesus and his 12 disciples on his last night before he gets arrested and then hung on the cross. This picture up here is the original, and it's called a fresco. It was actually painted on the wall. Well, the wall itself, after 600 years or so, is chipping and falling apart, and so is the paint. So the original picture is rough. Down here is a digital like remake of it, if you will, or a copy. And notice that the bright, vivid colors, and notice the 3 dimensions. So it looks like you can walk into that room, and it has depth to it and space to it. Just a beautiful picture. Okay. All right. So Leonardo was from Florence, and in his paintings, he was known for showing the human emotions. So back to Mona Lisa, and that look on her face and the shadowing, it's just beautiful. His best known paintings, of course, are The Last Supper and the Mona Lisa, 2 priceless paintings that were done by Da Vinci. Another important Italian artist was Michelangelo, who was a painter, sculptor, and architect. He was very religious, and he believed that humans were the symbol of God's beauty and perfection. And so in his works, quite often you will see scenes from the Bible, or characters from the Bible. His most famous is the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Rome, where it's just covered in different scenes from the Bible, starting with the Adam and Eve, Adam being created by God, and so it's a pretty amazing feat, painted up on this the ceiling of this huge chapel. His other most important work is a sculpture of David, who in the Bible was this young boy who was able to defeat the giant Goliath. Okay, so 2 important works by Michelangelo. Here's the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and in here you'll see these different Bible scenes, and this center part right here this is God and this is Adam, and it kind of represents the relation they had before the apple and all that was eaten, that they had this perfect relationship, and that they could see and touch and talk to each other. All right, so in England, the Renaissance changed. It was not about art as much as it was about writing and literature and the theater. They loved to go to the theater and see plays. One of their first most important writers was Geoffrey Chaucer. He writes in what's called the vernacular. So there were 2 kinds of English going on. There was Old English, which we wouldn't very recognize today, and then this newer called Middle English, and that was the vernacular, or their own language. He writes this really important book called The Canterbury Tales, and at the same time, the printing press is invented, and so it's now being spread everywhere throughout all of England, and people are actually learning how to read and reading this thing. And because he chose Middle English, it becomes the official language of England. Okay. And not long after Geoffrey Chaucer, then comes William Shakespeare, who's got to be one of the most famous writers of all time. He wrote comedies and tragedies and historical plays. Some of his most famous are Romeo and Juliet, about this young forbidden love where these 2 people from families who hate each other fall in love. And there's Hamlet, to be or not to be, that is the question. And then Macbeth, which is all about a murder and the guilt of that murder. And then, of course, these plays are very popular still today, and they're performed locally and nationally. And his plays are read, but they're also acted out, and movies have been made about them. So that's the Renaissance in England, all about writing. So the Renaissance was not just about art; it was science and math and medicine and writing. And hope you learned a little bit more. You are going to turn your notes in today, so please put your name on it and make sure you get that turned in. And I hope you guys have a great day and you get your projects done and turned in tomorrow. All right. See ya.